welcome. Thank you for joining us for our second plenary lecture of the 2019 Aspect Conference. Echoing Sarah's sentiments from yesterday, on behalf of the whole committee, we want to appreciate your participation, enthusiasm, collegiality today, also as we go forward to tomorrow. Very proud to introduce Dr. Alex Barder, who hails from Florida International University and the Department of Politics and International Relations. Primarily specializes in international relations theory and international historical sociology. His research primarily focuses on forms of international hierarchy, imperialism, and war, specifically regarding how international conditions affect processes of domestic state formation. Tonight's research talk, as it was handed to me, is titled Scientific Racism, Race War, and the Emergence of Global Politics. So please join me in giving a hand to Barder.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much to the organizers of the Aspect Conference. And thank you to Francois for the invitation to attend. I am very thankful to be given the opportunity to address you at the Aspect Conference this year. I actually first came to this conference back in 2012 when I was finishing my PhD, and I believe it was one of the first conferences that was initiated here. At the time, and today, I'm struck by the innovative work that many of my peers were doing at the time. And I'm continuously interested in the work of Aspect students as I've had the chance to read as a discussant over these years at many conferences. I think that that's a testament to the intellectually vibrant and pioneering environment that Francois Debrix has created as director in all of these years. Now, I mentioned this by way of some preliminary remarks before I get into my talk, because I do believe that it is imperative to develop spaces in which niche projects can be pursued. As I look at my own field of study, international relations, for example, there are a few places in the United States, perhaps outside the situation is more promising, where the critical research of Aspect students can actually find a home. While some figures in the discipline of IR have sounded the alarm regarding the demise of grand theory, there remains a deeply constricted view of what counts as legitimate epistemological positions and methodologies, and what counts as proper, that is to say, scientific research. The consequences of this is that our conceptualization of the world is increasingly at odds with the world as such. At the same time, we can obviously witness the extent to which the political sphere in Washington is increasingly unable to make sense of a world that no longer assumes the inevitability of American hegemony. The catastrophic consequences of almost 2 decades of global war on terror, the interminable war in Afghanistan, the continuous reverberations of the great financial crisis, right, increasingly feels like we are living through the decline of American empire. Though one would be remiss to find that idea of decline in American IR, let alone among the Washington punditry. If we who study international relations especially are not more open to a variety of critical epistemologies and methodologies, I do think we risk blinding ourselves to the ominous political changes that all too often seem to take us by surprise. We risk missing the elements that contribute to what Hannah Arendt called the Desert of Worthlessness. We risk simply seeking our oasis as an escape from the gathering sandstorms of, to quote Arendt, totalitarian movements whose chief characteristic is that they are extremely well adjusted to the conditions of the desert. Though Arendt had in mind her experience of totalitarianism of the 1930s and 1940s, our own time is faced with a revanchist racism and desires for authoritarianism or proto-fascism that can easily turn our common world of appearance into a desert. Fear and anxiety of decline, the inability to reconcile ourselves to a different world, will continue to render our politics and our political language increasingly pathological. So I begin with this observation because the subject of my talk is really rooted in our contemporary political moment, in which race and race thinking have seen an important revival in our politics. To be sure, the language of race and race thinking as it was articulated in its heyday remains taboo, for the most part. We cannot help but observe its rejuvenation in a whole variety of novel ways. The desire among many for walls, an important building block in perpetuating the desert, represents this attempt at cementing white supremacy. Nonetheless, in my own discipline of international relations, the subject of race has only been taken seriously by a minority of scholars. The publication of Bob Vitalis' White World Order, Black Power Politics was certainly significant in disabusing ourselves of the willful ignorance of our discipline's history and complicity in racism, justifications of empire, marginalizing African American scholars in the academy in the perpetual desire to make IR somehow relevant to policymakers. So turning to race in IR is uncomfortable. Right? It is uncomfortable because it challenges many of the founding ontological and normative assumptions of the discipline and its relationship to imperial powers, imperial centers. It problematizes many research agendas and projects. It calls into question long-standing assumptions about what was historically relevant and underlies a legacy of domination and exclusion that continues inside and outside the academy, which is why I believe places like Aspect are so important. As a result, I really do think that in order to understand one aspect of our contemporary moment, we do need to probe more deeply into the historical salience of race thinking. We need to see how others in the past have imagined the world in quite different ways than is commonly assumed in IR, and how their imaginary continues to resonate with our own today. So this is where I want to begin this story that I wish to tell today. I want to present an intellectual history of the 19th and early 20th century, specifically in terms of how global politics was understood as racial politics, and not simply in terms of relations between states. I want to show how the very idea of wars between races was seen as important as wars between states, that it was recognized as fundamental to what global politics was, and that importantly, until roughly the 1890s, wars between races meant the demise of so-called inferior races. I want to argue that a crucial shift occurred in the 1890s in which such faith in the triumph of so-called superior races was shaken, and that such a lack of conviction would have profound political consequences in the early 20th century. And then lastly, I just want to briefly underscore how this intellectual history continues to shape our own moment. In 1897, the American naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan published an essay in Harper's Magazine entitled The 20th Century Outlook. In his essay, Mahan describes the future contours of global politics in the next century and the potential fault lines that may lead to violent conflict. Mahan is clearly assuming that American isolation is at an end, and that while a focus on domestic development is important, quote, the changes in international relations and relative importance not merely in states of the European family, but among the peoples of the world at large, have been no less striking. However, Mahan's essay isn't an examination of the ebbs and flows of European power politics. Its focus isn't primarily on how the United States may fit within the larger balance of power politics among great powers. On the contrary, he already assumes that the United States is part of a larger European civilization. For an essay on international politics, it is striking to the contemporary reader the absence of reflection on the great states in shaping international politics. Instead, Mahan's essay focuses on the radical transformation of a global order as a result of the emergence of different races and civilizations and the potential frictions that would occur. For Mahan, the key question of the 20th century is, quote, whether Eastern or Western civilization is to dominate throughout the earth and to control its future. Moreover, as Mahan continues, it is essential to our own good, it is yet more essential as part of our duty to the commonwealth of peoples to which we racially belong, that we look with clear, dispassionate, but resolute eyes upon the fact that civilizations on different planes of material prosperity and progress, with very different spiritual ideals, and with very different political capacities, are fast closing together, end quote. Ultimately, Mahan's fear of a rising East, Japan, China, India, is that it will challenge an innervated European center that lacks the necessary vigor to maintain itself. The 20th century will be for Mahan a conflict over identity, i.e. a spiritual or racial conflict, rather than simply the equalizing role of material power. And it is a conflict that will be fought not only abroad, but also especially at home. To be sure, Mahan was undoubtedly part of a larger century-long discursive formation in which ideas, attitudes, practices of race and racialization were as central to imagining the global as were the provincial rivalries between European nation-states. Writers such as Robert Knox, Charles Hamilton Smith, Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, Charles Henry Pearson, Franklin Gildens, Lester Ward, Benjamin Kidd, and Madison Grant were among others who combined a racialized vision of the globe and the inevitable struggles between races. Theirs was the opposite of Whiggish histories of inevitable human progress and the Enlightenment humanitarian moralism that influenced social and political change. Theirs was, moreover, a persistent fear of civilizational decline amidst the emergence of different races competing for limited resources. What these authors capture is what I call a global racial imaginary, which organizes the world in ways that give it meaning and that affects domestic as much as international politics. Such a global imaginary encapsulates not only a different way of defining political units, but also an entirely different geographical representation of the world involving climatic and environmental factors. The global racial imaginary was not just an intellectual representation in which the rationality of power politics in the end manifested itself materially as state-centric policy. The importance of this global racial imaginary percolated in a wide range of policies, from legitimizing imperial domination, limited immigration, or domestic eugenics movements in the latter part of the 19th century. American foreign policy in particular was certainly reflected this global racial imaginary in important ways. Theodore Roosevelt's own writings in A Strenuous Life demonstrate his unabashed acceptance of racial hierarchy and struggle. For Roosevelt, to quote him, "In the West Indies and the Philippines alike, we are confronted by most difficult problems. It is cowardly to shrink from solving them in the proper way, for solve them they must be, if not by us, then by some stronger and more manifold race." And the nature of global politics was ultimately a struggle for a place among the peoples that shaped the destiny of mankind. By 1905, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine justified imperial intervention when the general loosening of ties of civilized society was observed and thus necessitated the exercise of the national police power. A wide range of thinkers throughout the 19th century used the scientific vocabulary of race in order to make intelligible a global politics of hierarchy rooted in white supremacy. So what I wish to do then in my talk is to show the central importance of a radically different ontology of global politics beyond the state-centrism that is all too often read back anachronistically in history. And my main emphasis is examining why race war was always assumed to be the background of global and domestic politics, and why it became such a source of anxiety that fuses the global and the domestic. By the middle of the 19th century, the scientific justification of racial differentiation became one way among many of justifying human inequality on a global scale. That is not to say that racism or processes of racialization was not prevalent beforehand, nor is it to say that the emergence of racial theories over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries predominantly structured relations of inequality and slavery, for example. To be sure, the Enlightenment period coincided with the proliferation of the Atlantic slave trade and the nascent capitalist modes of production necessitating a free and limitless labor power. Rather, racial explanations began in the 18th century with the attempt by European thinkers to explain the somatic and cultural diversities of people encountered in the early stages of European imperialism and settler colonialism. Attempts to provide a pseudo-scientific basis of the inevitability of racial extinction took on greater force of legitimacy with the acceptance of polygenism in the beginning of the 19th century. Whereas monogenism assumed that all human beings descended from the same original source and only degenerated at different rates throughout history, polygenism stipulated that human races were separate biological species, the descendants of different atoms. The importance of the polygenist claim is that it involved a change from an emphasis on the fundamental physical and moral homogeneity of man, despite superficial deficiencies, to an emphasis on the essential heterogeneity of mankind, despite the superficial similarities. And Nancy Steppen argues it was a shift from a sense of man as primarily a social being governed by social laws and standing apart from nature, to a sense of man as primarily a biological being, embedded in nature, governed by biological laws. It was a move away from 18th century optimism about man and faith in the adaptability of man's universal nature towards a 19th century biological pessimism, and a belief in the unchangeability of racial natures. By the middle of the 19th century, everyone was agreed. It seemed that in essential ways, the white race was superior to non-white races. Such biological pessimism, as Stepan argues, has crucial ramifications. The reification of somatic attributes as the etiology of human behavior would negate the very idea of human malleability, education, or progress. Studies of human skulls was referred to as anthroposociology, became central in defining racial difference. It would also cast doubt on the very idea of the civilizing mission that legitimized imperial domination throughout the 19th century, and instead justify the perspective that racial conflict was an inevitable feature of human nature. Nor, as we shall see, would a theory of evolution provide a mechanism for racial transformation from the so-called savage state to a civilized one, given the time spans involved. In fact, the emergence of evolutionary theory with Darwin would render scientifically moot the very distinction made by monogenism and polygenism. Focusing on racial distinctions in biological attributes would justify the premise that races were intrinsically incompatible, and it would constitute a global georacial imaginary that was distinct from that of the European state system. Thomas Jefferson, for example, writing in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, would seize on this event as a crucial indication that the emancipation of enslaved peoples within the Western political order would inevitably lead to outright violence and extermination. As Jefferson writes, deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries that they sustained, new provocations, the real distinction which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race. Though Jefferson's rationalization is rooted in the grievance of slavery, the hardening of this idea of incompatibility and inevitable violence between incompatible races was a continuous refrain among Southern writers in the Americas. In their notorious book, Types of Mankind, a key polygenist text of 1854, Josiah Knott and George Glidden argue that there is a fixed incompatibility between civilized and savage man. They cannot dwell together. To mix the races would inevitably result in, quote, a world that will retrograde instead of advancing in civilization. Moreover, as they write, history affords no evidence that education or any influence of civilization that may be brought to bear on races of inferior organization can radically change their physical, nor consequently their moral characters. Thus, any sort of political coexistence between hierarchically conceived races is rendered impossible. Sounding a greater alarm at the prospects of abolitionism in antebellum America, Thomas Dew, James Henry Hammond, and William Harper, in their book Pro-Slavery Argument, published in 1853, argue that abolition would inevitably, like Jefferson argued, result in race war. To one who knows, as they write, anything of the nature of man and human society, it would be unnecessary to argue that this state of things cannot continue, but that one race must be driven out by the other, or exterminated, or again, enslaved. To be sure, one doesn't need to simply turn to explicitly racist Southern texts to understand the justification of racial incompatibility and the possibilities of racial violence. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America of 1838 tackles this question in Chapter 10, entitled A Few Remarks on the Present-Day State of the Probable Future of the Three Races Which Live in the Territory of the United States. So as an aside, it's interesting that Tocqueville's partner, Gustave de Beaumont, explicitly published in 1835 in the form of a novel, Marie ou l'esclavage aux États-Unis, his own critique of American racial relations, which interestingly fell into oblivion, and a new edition did not emerge until 1958. Tocqueville turns to the question of the two races, what he calls the Indians and the Negroes, as one of the elements which, quote, threaten this confederation that his work examines. For Tocqueville, the American continent is occupied by three naturally distinct, hostile races. While in the case of the Native Americans, white expansionism resulted in their forcible eviction on the margins of civilization and their increasing reduction to a state of savagery, it is the so-called Negro question that preoccupies them. Slavery, Tocqueville assumes, has so debased the black population that emancipation is rendered impossible. As he writes, as soon as it is agreed that whites and emancipated Negroes are placed upon the same land, like two alien nations, it will not be difficult to understand that only two possibilities exist for the future. Either Negroes and whites must blend together completely, or they must part. The former is assumed to be precluded by nature, custom, and opinion, and hence Tocqueville assumes the inevitability of racial conflicts. To quote him, if the whites of North America remain united, it is difficult to believe that the Negroes will escape destruction threatening them. They will be defeated by the sword or misery. Race war, as Tocqueville writes, is the inevitable struggle between the whites and the blacks of the South of the Union. It constantly haunts the imagination of the Americans like a nightmare. But whereas the race war in the American imagination is discerned by the vision of incompatible peoples within a particular polity, the English writer Robert Knox globalizes this idea of race war. His main work, The Races of Men, a Fragment, originally published in 1850, takes the inevitability of racial conflict to be the fundamental engine of world history. As he famously asserted in the preface of his book, the basis of the view that I take of man is his physical structure. If I may say, his zoological history. To know this must be the first step in all inquiries into man's history. All abstractions, neglecting or despising this great element, the physical character and constitution of man, his mental and corporal attributes must of necessity be at least utopian, if not erroneous. Men are of various races. Call them species, if you will, call them permanent varieties, it matters not. The simple fact, remains just as it was. Men are of different races. Now, the object of these lectures is to show that in human history, race is everything. In his chapter entitled The Dark Races of Men, Knox is emphatic in stressing the seemingly unalterable forms of various races, even if, and here Knox appears to be a monogeneticist, the unity of man appears evident. Alongside the question of the origins of the dark races, the so-called dark races, Knox aims to explain why destiny seems to have marked them for destruction. What Knox is aiming at is an explanation for why the dark races, which are assumed to be a wide variety of peoples located in Africa, in North America, the Native Americans, for example, in Asia, and even in Europe, for example. He says that the Lapps in Finland were part of these dark races, are inevitably going to be extinct. What constitutes the fundamental relationship between races for Knox is an ahistorical and inescapable idea that, quote, might has always constituted right. A political association in the form of a state, and by implication a society of states, is but the, quote, mere accidental political assemblage of people, a human contrivance based on no assurance of perseverance and on no bond of nature, but on protocols and treaties, on the mockery of words called constitutions and laws of nations, made to bind the weak to be broken by the strong. The inevitability of the extinction of the dark races lies in their inability to progress, their historically static place compared to the fair Saxon and Celtic races. So there are three important points that I want to stress in Knox's text that I think helps us understand what this global racial imaginary implies. First, for Knox, race war is an endemic and determinative feature of how the world is. It is a natural condition. This also means that race conflict isn't simply between Europeans and non-Europeans. Knox is clear and in fact consistent enough to argue that interstate European conflicts are themselves reflective of fundamental racial tensions that would continue to play out even after the other races would become extinct. To reiterate, Knox's emphasis on race war, which may have been influenced by Hegel's own philosophy of history, shows the ephemerality of political institutions, including the very society of states. Second, while Knox is emphatic that the weaker races will inevitably become extinct, he does focus on the role of the environment in potentially stemming this process. As Knox writes, within the tropic climate comes to the rescue of those whom nature made and whom the white man strives to destroy. Though the environment or climate cannot change the permanent racial characteristics of the so-called lower races, and hence is not a factor in the development of racial difference, for Knox the climate or environment plays a role in precluding the outright colonization of certain spaces, such as the tropics. As he writes, a European race cannot labor, cannot appropriate the soil to themselves, cannot multiply their offspring. Haiti, moreover, has shown the white man that he cannot colonize a tropical country. It must revert to those races on whom nature has bestowed a constitution adapted to labor under the tropical sun. So put differently, a consequence of this lack of ability to colonize certain zones implies that Knox believes that the various European imperial projects are doomed to failure, hypocritical in their concern with the native population, and in fact only allows for the possibility of exterminatory violence. Lastly, it bears emphasis that Knox's work is meant to be a detached, objective, scientific analysis of global history and its implications for global politics. The basis of his pseudo-scientific theory of politics was located in individual physiology, craniology, and ultimately the biological or zoological characteristics of a race. The problem with Knox's text, however, is precisely that it did not provide a scientific account for the natural inevitability of racial extinction on a global scale. Aside from assumptions about the fatal impact of racial interactions, the lack of progress by inferior races, Knox does not elaborate a theory of extinction. As I noted earlier, environmental factors may mitigate, potentially indefinitely, the global extinction of non-European races due to the limitations of the colonial encounter and project. Nonetheless, the introduction of evolutionary theory with Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in the late 1850s adds a crucial element to scientific racism and assumes Europeans that so-called primitive races and cultures are not only doomed by the inexorable laws of nature, but also meriting their pending extinction. Darwin's notion of the struggle for existence, which was shaped by Thomas Malthus's an essay of the principle of population, reveals an organic world continuously shaped by necessary destruction, extinction, and extermination. Absent that, geometric increases in population growth, it was assumed, would strip the Earth of resources for species survival. Darwin's discussion of the ebbs and flows of natural selection also crucially applied to the struggle for existence between human races. And this is clearer in his latter work, The Descent of Man, which directly applies natural selection and evolution to human societies. For Darwin, quote, extinction follows chiefly from the competition of tribe with tribe and race with race, end quote. But rather than seeing this as the fateful product of imperial interaction between racially unequal groups, Darwin surmises that a leading factor in the extinction of the lower races was infanticide. As he writes in The Descent of Man, if savages of any race are induced suddenly to change their habits of life, they become more or less sterile, and the young offspring suffer in health. In other words, racial extinction isn't simply a matter of genocidal violent practice of a perceived natural right of conquest per Knox, for example. Racial extinction is fundamentally rooted in the biological determinism associated with racial interaction, and hence why Darwin draws a parallel between the extinction of the fossil horse and its replacement by countless troops of the Spanish horse. Darwin distinguishes civilized and savages not just in terms of biological attributes related to evolution, but also on the basis of how civilized races interact with each other. For example, Darwin writes that with highly civilized nations, continued progress depends in a subordinate degree on natural selection, for such nations do not supplant and exterminate one another as do savage tribes. Is there a young child here?
Next generation.
Even though within such nations are inferior individuals and groups that may lead to degeneracy, as Darwin writes, it is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. These nations are able to tolerate the social instinct of sympathy, according to Darwin. In other words, what distinguishes civilized from savage is that the civilized nations are able to engender cooperation and ethics. However, this is entirely absent from either civilized and savage relations, or between savages themselves. Thus, ethical considerations are devoid of the larger questions about the relative positions of civilized and savage groups within the evolutionary framework. The conflation of biological explanations with racial conflict reaches an important moment with Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism. As Darwin himself recognized, progress cannot be assumed to be synonymous with the trajectory of the evolutionary survival. Spencer echoes this when he writes in Volume 1 of Principles of Sociology, evolution is commonly conceived to imply in everything an intrinsic tendency to become something higher. This is an erroneous conception of it. Consequently, as Spencer writes, and here I quote a significant passage, a social organism, like an individual organism, undergoes modifications until it comes into equilibrium with environing factors, and therefore continues without further change of structure. When the conditions are changed meteorologically or geologically, or by alterations in the flora and the fauna, or by migrations consequent on pressures of population, or by flight before usurping races, some changes of social structure results. But this change does not necessarily imply advance. Often it is towards neither a higher nor lower structure. Where the habits entails modes of life that are inferior, degradation follows. Only occasionally does the new combination of factors produce a change constituting a step in social evolution and initiating a social type which spreads and supplants inferior types. And with these superorganic aggregates, progression in some cases, retrogression in others. The key, and this is I think the key statement, the more evolved societies drive the less evolved societies into unfavorable habitats and so entail on them decrease in size or decay of structure or both. Spencer appears to imply that an important component of social progress is an ineluctable global racial struggle, notwithstanding the claim that progress is more aleatory than it may appear. Such a racial struggle has its roots in the correspondence between social and biological organisms. The killing off of relatively feeble tribes, Spencer argues, or tribes relatively wanting in endurance or courage or sagacity or power of cooperation must have tended ever to maintain and occasionally to increase the amounts of life-preserving powers possessed by men. So Spencer's emphasis throughout the Principles of Sociology is that struggle and war are the historical levers of societal change. Nonetheless, the social Darwinian faith in the inevitable demise of weaker races would radically change beginning in the 1890s. Though there were significant works beforehand which called into question the inevitable predominance of so-called higher races, making up the standard of civilization, it is in the last decade of the 19th century where profound anxiety of the longevity of European or Western supremacy began to be felt. As Mahan's work shows, this anxiety projected on a world that was increasingly perceived as embodying racial and civilizational conflicts, of which the West was no longer assumed to be supreme. The anxiety translated itself not only in the reconceptualization of a world made up of competing races, but especially about the apprehensions over internal characteristics that may weaken the Western races. So what I want to focus on next is in the work of the English-Australian writer Charles Pearson in his work The National Life of Character, A Forecast, which was originally published in 1893 and had a profound influence during his day. Pearson's work is emblematic of the leitmotif about the relative Western decline and the emergence of a world made up of a plurality of races. Finally, I'll turn to Lothrop Stoddard's work and the central importance attached to global race war. And what I wish to do with the concluding session is to contextualize why there's such a radical shift in sentiment about this racial imaginary of global politics at the end of the 19th century. So if until the last decade or so of the 19th century, a quote-unquote scientific recognition of the inevitability of racial extinction of inferior races was taken for granted as a natural outcome of racial inequality, what emerges afterwards can be understood as a repoliticization of racial struggle and war. In other words, racial extinction is no longer taken as the fundamental assurance of white supremacy in structuring the global racial imaginary. Instead, fears of unbounded race wars coming to the shores of the West become increasingly prevalent in American and European discourse. By the late 1890s, a new fictional literature, commonly referred to as the invasion literature, portrays the rise of Asia as the well-known Yellow Peril that will inevitably challenge Western dominance. A lack of faith in the inevitable doom of distinct races would translate itself into various political commitments to not only guard against racial infiltration at home, but to activate state institutions under the guise of making one's race healthier relative to others through the adoption of various eugenics programs, for example. Furthermore, fears of global race conflict were also stoked by the intensification of inter-imperial rivalries at the end of the 19th century. Indeed, a significant facet of this invasion literature also took for granted the possibility of intra-European conflicts, which would increasingly make it vulnerable to outside forces. Nonetheless, while there is a tremendous literature on the processes of racialization that swept domestic spaces in the West, what is lacking in the greater recognition of how the idea of inevitable global racial conflicts are to come, for example in Mahan, structured the very terms of domestic processes. So what I want to highlight is how this idea of repoliticization of racial war comes to be conceptualized through this fear of decline and potential violent end of white supremacy. In the first chapter of the National Life of Character, entitled Unchangeable Limits of Higher Races, Charles Pearson begins with the assumption discussed above, or that I discussed earlier, concerning the inevitable triumph of Western races against others. Pearson's argument is that the assumption is no longer tenable. While there certainly have been cases in which fateful impact between Europeans and non-Europeans have resulted in the demise of the latter, the assumption that races such as the Chinese or Japanese or what he calls the Hindus would suffer the same fate is no longer credible. Instead of population decline, as he writes, the lower races have nearly doubled in proportion since 1863, when 1/7 of the population was European. Pearson argues that European population expansion throughout the imperial periphery cannot simply displace the native population, even in Africa, the last colonial frontier. Tropical zones, as many have argued in the past, for example Knox, are simply not amenable to European colonization. European colonial populations are thus too heavily reliant on native labor and would inevitably decline or be absorbed. Imperial expansion is thus at an end. And as Pearson continues, the most highly civilized races of the world, being those at present which are more or less purely Aryan, are not likely to wrest any large tracts of territory from half-civilized or half-savage peoples. And education, public health, and the desire for productive native population under the imperial civilizing mission promises to actually improve and not only the survivability of all the races, but of creating the conditions for a world in which such races radically challenge European hegemony. As Pearson famously writes, the day will come, and perhaps in a not far distant future, when the European observer will look around to see the globe girdled with a continuous zone of black and yellow races, no longer too weak for aggression or under tutelage, but independent, or practically so, in government, monopolizing the trade of their own region, and circumscribing the industry of Europeans. When Chinamen and the nations of Hindustan, the states of Central and South America, by that time predominantly Indian, and it may be African nations of the Congo and Zambezi, under the dominant caste of foreign rulers, are represented by fleets in European seas, invited to international conferences, and welcomed as allies in the quarrels of the civilized world. The citizens of these countries will then be taken up into the social relations of the white races, will throng the English turf or the salons of Paris, and will be admitted to intermarriage. We shall wake to find ourselves elbowed and hustled, and perhaps thrust aside by peoples who look down upon, that we look down upon as servile, and thought of bound always to minister to our needs. Pearson is essentially asking his readers to imagine a world, one in which he himself scarcely imagines living in, such that the inevitable biological determinism of racial doom was not only wrong, but that the non-European races would eventually become co-equal participants. To be sure, Pearson is by no means advocating such a world as any sort of emancipatory ideal. This is a dystopian diagnosis in which Europeans were increasingly to find themselves pitted against resurgent races. The global race war continues as before, but with the ominous idea that enemy races are actually capable of surviving and fighting back against an increasingly decadent West. Pearson's view of a world in which Western hegemony wanes was really meant to be reflective of the loss of vitality or character, of what many at the time saw in terms of masculine ideas of virility, for example, in Roosevelt, in the late 19th century Western democratic societies themselves. His claims that the Chinese population reached over 400 million stoked the anxieties of Theodore Roosevelt and the Washington establishment over the potential decline of the American birth rate and the vitality of the white race. Roosevelt thought that, quote, competition between races was reducing itself to the warfare of the cradle. No race has any good chance to win a great place unless it consists of good breeders as well as good fighters. Moreover, this concern with good breeders suggested a racialized idea of what type of breeder Roosevelt had in mind. As Roosevelt feared, the census figures of the 1890 revealed a situation where it proved increasingly problematic to, as he wrote, prevent the higher races from losing their nobler traits and from being overwhelmed by the lower races. Between poor white families and the rush of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, fears about race suicide permeated political discussions during the 1890s and would give scientific credence, quote-unquote scientific credence to the development of eugenics. Suspicions of race suicide and the possibility of racial conflict permeated domestic politics were reflected in two well-known texts of the early 20th century. Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916, polemicized against the consequences of a domestic melting pot of different races. For Grant, the racial mixture is a recipe for disaster. Whether we like it or not, as he writes, the result of mixing of two races in the long run gives us a race reverting to a more ancient, generalized, and lower type. Grant's focus is on the very somatic cranial features that define racial difference. For him, the so-called Nordic race was perpetually under assault from inferior stock, especially immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Racial melange, or the politics of racial blindness, for Grant, will inevitably lead to America's demise. Thus, Grant advocates, and here I quote him, a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would solve the whole question in 100 years, as well as enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails and hospitals and insane asylums. The individual himself can be nourished, educated, and protected by the community during his lifetime, but the state, through sterilization, must see to it that his line stops with him, or else future generations will be cursed with an ever-increasing load of misguided sentimentalism. This is a practical, merciful, and inevitable solution of the whole problem, and can be applied to an ever-widening circle of social discards, beginning always with the criminal, the diseased, the insane, and extending gradually to types which may be called weaklings rather than defectives, and perhaps ultimately to worthless race types. And it is not by chance that Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race was a deep influence on Adolf Hitler. By the 1920s, the concern with how racial divisions would undermine Western hegemony became deeply prevalent. Lothrop Stoddard, a student of Madison Grant, effectively combines this fear of internal race suicide with a global awareness of the precariousness of the West in the 20th century. For Stoddard, the risk of race conflict isn't so much in the possibilities of, to quote him, the subjugation of the white lands by colored armies, although that remains a distinct possibility. Rather, what concerns him is in his infamous The Rising Tide of Color against white world supremacy, is the more, quote him, the more enduring conquests like migration, which would swamp whole populations and turn countries now white into colored man's lands irretrievably lost to the white world. Stoddard's fear is that the continuation of internecine war in the white world weakens it to the point of leaving it open to racial threats emanating from the colonial world. Nonetheless, in Extremis, Stoddard evokes in his reader's imagination the very idea of a pan-colored alliance for the universal overthrow of white hegemony at a single stroke, a dream which would turn into a nightmare of race war, besides which the late struggle in Europe of the First World War would seem the various child's play, as he writes. Towards the end of the rising tide of color, Stoddard's central recommendation is that some sort of accommodation has to be reached with quote-unquote Asia, without which the horrific fantasy of global race war will inevitably materialize. As Stoddard writes, we whites have to abandon our tacit assumption of permanent domination over Asia, while Asiatics have to forego their dreams of migration to white lands and penetration of Africa and Latin America. Unless some such understanding is arrived at, the world will drift into a gigantic race war, and genuine race war means a war to the knife. In a deeply unsettling way, Stoddard's vision of race wars foreshadows the global conflagration of identity that occurred in the Second World War. Indeed, the naturalized assumptions about racial incompatibilities, coupled with anxieties about the longevity of the white world, conjured fantasies of either inevitable doom or the necessity of extraordinary means of racial safeguarding. For example, the Armenian genocide of 1915 left an indelible trace in German race thinking of the 1920s. Genocidal violence was perceived as necessary to protect the state from the intrinsic internal threat posed by an incompatible race. Though the language of race was somewhat absent in Turkish sources, the Armenians were racialized in Western accounts at the time, for example, in the writings of Ambassador Henry Morgenthau. Right? And this is Stefan Ehring's work here is, I think, quite apropos, especially his book called Justifying Genocide, Germany and the Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, published in 2016. And I discussed this at some length in my article, Race War and the Global Imperial Imaginary, or the Global Imperial Order, the Armenian Genocide of 1915. By the 1920s, with the maelstrom of political, economic, and social crises tearing at the potential fabric of the European continent, the intelligibility of these dire Jeremiahs would evidently become internalized to deadly effect with the advent of right-wing extremism and Nazism. The point is that the faith in the inevitable demise of quote-unquote inferior racial competitors that mid-19th century racial theorists took for granted was gone, and what replaced it was a perpetual anxiety in the coming end of white supremacy. The distance between that fear of racial decline and the genocidal ambitions of the Nazis was actually quite narrow. Heinrich Himmler, for example, in his infamous Posen speech of 1943, rationalized the Holocaust as part of a larger, to quote him, faithful struggle within Asia, certain to break forth once again. Now, while Mahan did not explicitly argue for the necessity of exterminatory violence in repelling the threats to American and white supremacy, Mahan's vision of the 20th century corresponds to this latent anxiety of a world radically transforming itself, globally and domestically. And this anxiety, I think, derives from the idea that the globe is fundamentally constituted according to incompatible racial and hierarchical divisions, and that Western hegemony was in an inexorable decline. Almost a quarter century ago, after the end of the Cold War, Samuel Huntington popularized the notion that global politics would revolve around identity. The emphasis on civilizational difference naturally evokes parallels to racial difference. But more importantly for Huntington, the coming identity conflicts call into question the very identity of the United States and of the West because of the porosity of its borders and a perceived lack of commitment to its cultural or even its racial origins. The political salience of Huntington's anxiety about American identity found its voice in Patrick Buchanan's 1992 electoral campaign, with its anti-immigration cultural war focus. Buchanan's campaign would prove to be the inchoate precursor of Donald J. Trump's run for the presidency, on a platform of stoking racial and misogynist resentments and fears of American decline. The rise to prominence of the alt-right in the United States, along with far-right populist movements in Europe, the vote for Brexit, and the proto-fascist politics of Eastern Europe reveals a persistent apprehension over the domestic implications of transformations wrought by the great financial crisis of 2008 and globalization generally. I suspect that even if Trump were to lose in 2020, the white supremacist politics that he encouraged will continue to cast its long shadow over our politics. The same holds for Europe. In an essay entitled The New Empire Within Britain, written in 1982, Salman Rushdie recognized that, to quote him, 400 years of conquest and looting, 4 centuries of being told that you are superior to the fuzzy wuzzies and the wogs, leave their stain. The stain has seeped into every part of the culture, the language and daily life, and nothing much has been done to wash it out. Indeed, that stain remains with us today. Thank you.